Soon after I began this investigation, I realised I needed someone on the ground in Tokyo to help me. So I hired a producer, Ryushi Lindsay. I expected he'd help me to translate, maybe even visit some of the people that I couldn't get to. But I wasn't expecting him to give me the name of the Faceless Man. It's February 2022. I'm at home in Los Angeles, 16 hours behind Ryushi in Tokyo. And I know it well, because it's 3:30 in the morning and I'm sat up, wide awake, waiting for his message. Ryushi, how you doing? You good?
Hey man, yeah, good. How are you?
Well, I'm pretty excited, to be honest with you. I don't want to get my hopes up too much, but you say there's some news. Ryushi is on the trail of an elusive investigative journalist called Fumiya Ichihashi. Because, as we've learned, Ichihashi claims he knows the identity of the Faceless Man. He's even written a book about it. From what he says, my investigation could be open and shut very quickly.
He says that he knows the guy who hired the killer. He has met and spoken with this guy, Kaneda, who hired this killer.
Kaneda says, I know who the killer is because I hired him.
Right. And identifies him, gives Ichihashi the whole backstory.
I'm on a journey to investigate one of the most baffling unsolved murders you'll find anywhere in the world, and to identify the person responsible, the Faceless Man. But maybe somebody's already beaten me to the punch.
The killer, yes, did the murders and then escaped overseas, then sort of established himself as an international hitman, and sort of comes and goes, carrying out hits around the world.
Or perhaps, like everything in this case, things aren't quite what they seem. From USG Audio and What's the Story Sounds, this is an original podcast series. I'm Nick Obregon, and this is Faceless, Episode 2. I'll come to the investigative journalist and the hitman theory in a moment. But if you paid attention in episode 1, I expect there's one detail you're probably screaming about. I walked you through the crime as it's been reported, and the fact that at the scene there was a large amount of the killer's DNA. So, surely that's case closed, right? The blood gets tested, the DNA profile is extracted, and hey presto, you have the identity of your killer. If you watch CSI, you can be forgiven for thinking all of this happens in less than 30 seconds. But while the TV shows we watch may paint an overly simplistic picture, the fact is, our DNA is as unique to us as anything else. And if a crime scene investigator can find it, well, you're almost certain to be caught at some point. But that's not the case everywhere. The case I'm investigating, the Miyazawa murders, should on the face of it be open and shut. The blood and DNA of the offender is all over the crime scene. We heard about a glove worn by the killer, soaked in his own blood after he sustained a deep wound to his hand. There's also his feces in the toilet, and samples of his saliva, hair, more blood littered across the house. And yet, all of that mountain of DNA hasn't led to the identity of a suspect. I want to know why.
So, in 2010, my daughter was born. But in the hospital, there was a mix-up with name tags.
Dr. Kim Ki-bum is a specialist forensic expert who runs his own lab in Tokyo. He told me he became fascinated with DNA after the birth of his daughter.
And so, at the time, obviously, just after giving birth, it's a time with a lot of confusion. Because of this missing name tag, we wanted to make sure that this was our daughter. So, we DNA tested her. The test we used had a 99.9% accuracy. And fortunately, the result told us that this was our child, which was a big relief.
From this unexpected episode, Dr. Kim trained up in DNA science, and his lab in Tokyo is now called upon by the police. Once a month or so, they approach him to do some work on a case.
But the whole experience got me interested in how we use DNA. We are mainly used for missing and non-identified people. We can compare those non-identified by using their DNA and my database. And so, we can help find out who the body belongs to.
Basically, the police turn to Dr. Kim for a second opinion. Despite having extensive internal resources, the cops only do tests in one way. And if those tests fail to get a good enough sample from, say, a dead body, that's when they turn to Dr. Kim. But this is where things get unusual, because whether it's identifying a body or identifying a serial killer, the police won't use that DNA to help them. It's purely a tool used for confirmation, like identifying Dr. Kim's daughter.
The police use only identical DNA profiles. I mean, if you are searching a database, the sample you have could correlate with certain data. For example, it might be similar to their parents or other types of relationship. You can find close matches or expand the search. That's what we can do if we are allowed.
Okay, so, in Japan, the police are prohibited by law from using a DNA sample to go fishing for clues. They can't use it to compare to online databases in the way you can in the US or the UK to find a close relative or even a close match. They can't use the DNA to appeal to certain communities, to work out what part of the world the offender may have come from, to target their investigation in that direction. DNA in Japan, it turns out, is limited.
We are good at collecting DNA in this country, but we are terrible at using it.
So, when the Tokyo Metropolitan Police arrive at a crime scene full of the killer's DNA, they're not necessarily jumping for joy. Because that DNA, well, it's much less use than a set of fingerprints or an eyewitness. In the last episode, we heard Takeshi Tsuchita, the former police chief, who would go on to lead the investigation, say something interesting.
There were so many fingerprints left at the scene, and so it would be very easy to check the records of anyone who's ever been arrested. And also, we could fingerprint all those people known to the victims. So I believed at the time that we would be very close to solving it.
Fingerprints. The cops were excited by the fingerprints. Even though there was a bloodied glove full of the killer's DNA left at the scene, they thought it was the fingerprints that could unlock this case. And now that makes sense. I asked Takeshi Tsuchita, the police officer who would go on to lead the investigation, what he knew about the killer's DNA.
The DNA investigation is all within an internal department, and they cannot currently reveal any information at all. The only thing that they can publicly say is whether DNA matches or doesn't match to someone else. That is the only thing that can be publicly announced.
So the DNA information is a closely guarded secret. Whatever the police have learned, well, it's for their eyes only. Except, I'd read something different. So I'm doing a little late night reading on Wikipedia, of all places. And there's something really weird here, because it's talking about the killer's DNA, right? And this is Wikipedia. I mean, it gets into his DNA breakdown. It's saying that it's interesting because they're saying he was half Mediterranean, half East Asian, which seems like a lot of detail. I mean, can Wikipedia know this much? Or is just Wikipedia wrong? Like anybody can edit an article and put whatever they want to put there. So I'm going to have to ask the chief about this, because if this is true, this is wild. I needed to know more. So I pressed the chief.
感じたのは解剖の
Within the inner circle, very central to the case, they shared some samples with researchers at a university. That's how they were able to determine that the DNA of the killer is from Southern Europe and from Eastern Asia. And this was leaked to the press, and that's how the public found out about it. And now it's even on Wikipedia.
Okay, the information on Wikipedia is correct. It was leaked against the will of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department, or TMPD, and it made its way into the public arena. And yet, despite the fact that the whole world can read about the DNA profile of the killer, right there on Wikipedia or anywhere else, Tokyo police still refuse to talk about it. Now retired, the chief still uses his spare time to appeal for information on the case, and he's been calling for the police to be more open, but they refuse.
I went to the police and told them. I went to the head of the investigative team, and then his boss as well, saying that we need to put this information out there. I said, I'm going to put it on my information leaflets. But they told me that this is leaked information. Please don't use it. In fact, the TMPD even went to Wikipedia to ask them to remove this information about the DNA, about the killer's ethnicity. And so Wikipedia said, yes, if you can give us a document stating that this is false information, then we will take it down. But the TMPD didn't do that because it's got to be the truth.
So, the Tokyo police even tried to have the information removed from Wikipedia because it's not officially released. And that feels wild to me. The cat's already out of the bag. But let's look at what that information really is. It's the DNA of the killer. According to the chief and Wikipedia, the killer's blood type is type A, and his DNA shows a mix from Southern Europe and Eastern Asia. So that could be Korea, China, Taiwan, Japan. So we know the killer who murdered the Miyazawa family is mixed race. But that's not all. I found an article back from when the DNA analysis was first leaked to the press, and in it, some precise details did emerge. The unofficial DNA report doesn't just say 50% Mediterranean, 50% East Asian. It actually specifies that it's the killer's mother who has the Mediterranean genes, specifically from a region near the Adriatic Sea, around Italy, Greece, or Croatia. And it specifies the killer's father is East Asian, and it says the actual genetic material would be found in 1 in 13 Japanese, 1 in 10 Chinese, and 1 in 4 Koreans. And that led the police to our first theory.
I'm Kathleen Goldhar, and I'm the host of a new podcast, Crime Story. Every week, we bring you a different crime, told by the storyteller who knows it best.
You got one witness who can't be found. You got another witness who's murdered.
We couldn't sugarcoat the story.
I was getting calls from Cosby's attorney threatening to sue every day.
Every crime in one way or another is a reflection of who we are as a people, as a city, as a country.
Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
Theory number 1. The killer is a Korean who has stayed below the police radar. Using the DNA breakdown as a starting point, the Tokyo police leaned into the statistics. And it is more likely that the killer hails from Korea rather than Japan. But it's not just the DNA that has informed this theory. You'll remember that the killer left his clothes at the crime scene, and we will come back to those clothes and what they can tell us in a later episode. But one of those items of clothing was the killer's shoes, a pair of Slazenger tennis shoes in a size 9.5 or 27.5 centimetres, white with a black wavy line down the side and the Slazenger brand name. To the untrained eye, they're just a pair of sneakers, nothing extraordinary and no unique features which could identify their owner. They're mass-produced by a big international company. But it's the size of the shoe which gives police a clue. Because Tokyo police learned that a size 9.5, well, that wasn't available for sale in Japan. Those sneakers in that size were never sold in any store in any city in Japan. But they were made and sold in Korea. We're starting to build a picture, just like the police did, of who the Faceless Man might be, and we've got a long way to go. But genetically speaking, we know far more than we officially should. The killer is a mixed-race male, most likely from Korea, and we have a pair of sneakers not available for sale in Japan, but sold in Korea. So, Korea is where the investigating officers focus their attention.
I didn't believe that it was someone from here. I thought it's unlikely that someone who's educated in Japan, who's culturally Japanese, could have done this.
That was Chief Tsuchita speaking in episode 1. He'd latched on to an idea pretty early on that the killer wasn't Japanese. And the media, well, they latched onto that idea too. This is Julian Ryle, who you also heard in the last episode. He was a reporter for the Japan Times.
The shoes were not available in that size in Japan. They were only available in Korea. So, I think there's elements of the Japanese media that are almost relieved to hear that it probably wasn't a Japanese.
I guess it's a common response for people to look outside first of all. They'd say, oh, it's a monster who did this, not one of us. It couldn't be someone from around here.
It can be blamed on a foreigner. And I get the impression that, some of the more conservative, some of the more right-wing papers were quite happy that there is evidence that this was not perpetrated by a Japanese.
Rightly or wrongly, some media favoured the foreigner angle. And the police did too. The chief told me they worked the Korean angle pretty hard.
We especially requested assistance with the Schlesinger shoes, which were manufactured in Korea and a size that wasn't sold in Japan. So we went to Korea to get this information. But in addition to that, the South Korean government has all its citizens' fingerprints on record. Our killer's prints were checked against this database, but no matches were found.
The South Korean government fingerprints all of its citizens when they turn 17. Every single South Korean person living in the country is added to a database. And those fingerprints are stored for life by the government, and they're used to verify people's identity. If a South Korean needs a new passport or needs to prove who they are to the police, well, it's a simple process. They just give their fingerprints. I also learned that the South Korean government has been collecting these fingerprints since way before the year 2000. So, if the prints collected at the crime scene have been checked against this Korean database and there's no match, well then it seems pretty likely that the Faceless Man isn't a Korean national. But that's not all. It's not just residents of South Korea who have to hand over the fingerprints. In addition, every visitor to South Korea has to provide their fingerprints at their point of entry. Holiday makers, business travellers, they're all required to provide fingerprints. And these too are stored for life by the South Korean government. So if you've ever been to South Korea, your prints will be in a vault. By my math, that means the Faceless Man has never travelled to South Korea either. I've worked through all the different possibilities, and maybe you're doing the same right now. But my conclusion just keeps coming back to maybe the Korean angle isn't right. The only thing which seems to hold any water is the Schlesinger sneakers. They are the only concrete link to Korea. But what if I told you that those sneakers aren't a concrete link either? I've learned that they could be bought in the US or anywhere in the world via mail order. I spent weeks trying to get through to Slazenger to find out about those sneakers, where exactly they were sold, when, and while officially they couldn't help me, those shoes could be purchased via mail order and shipped wherever. So I don't believe those sneakers are inextricably linked to Korea after all. I think it's worth adding that, unlike DNA, Japanese police can test fingerprints. They have access to the fingerprint database in the country, and when they ran those prints of the Faceless Man, there was obviously no match. Since 2007, fingerprints are also required from any foreigner entering Japan as a tourist or business traveller, but there has been no match on that front either. Okay, so the Faceless Man apparently hasn't travelled into Japan since 2007, and hasn't committed a crime which automatically would put his prints onto the database. Back in 2001, Tokyo police also ran the prints through Interpol, as the chief told me.
As an Interpol member, Japan can send fingerprints to any other member state. But when we did that, no matches were ever found.
Interpol is the International Criminal Police Organisation, but it's not like some global FBI. I asked Interpol what they did, and they said they couldn't comment on specific cases. But they did explain that Interpol holds a central database of fingerprints, and the Faceless Man would have been checked against that database. Even today, if his prints suddenly got added to that database anywhere in the world, a match would be triggered. Are we saying that this killer doesn't have a criminal record anywhere in the world? No history of violence, but yet decided to kill a family of 4 and then just carry on with his life? Well, this is where my producer Ryushi and I stumbled across something pretty remarkable. Listen, man, I need you to maybe look into something for me, because I've heard about this guy called Fumiya Ichihashi. He's an investigative journalist. You heard of him?
Yeah, I know the name. He's from what I know, he writes sort of lots of books that uncover, that look into the big cases of the past 50 years or so.
It says investigative journalist Fumiya Ichihashi has spent years researching the case, the Setagaya murders, and has written a book concluding the killer was a former South Korean army soldier turned killer for hire. You reckon you could get a hold of this guy, maybe track him down and ask him if he'd talk to us?
Yeah, let me have a look. I just quickly, while you're talking, I just quickly did a search online, and I found out who published that book. So I'll reach out through them.
5 days later, and Ryushi promised me some news. As I sit, wide awake in the middle of the night, I'm wondering if he's tracked Ichihashi down, if he's tracked the hitman down. Is this the moment where I actually find out who the Faceless Man is?
Bad news, I'm afraid. Apparently, he just doesn't do press. He doesn't do interviews. He doesn't give statements.
So wait, so he's an investigative journalist who doesn't do press?
But then I've also read that he might not be a single person at all, but might be a group of writers.
To say I was disappointed is an understatement. Ryushi told me that Ichihashi, well, it's a fake name. And whoever he is, they don't want to talk about their claims, which just smells off to me. Every author I know would jump at the chance to talk about their book. But Ryushi could put some flesh on the bones of Ichihashi's claims.
He writes a lot about the criminal underworld. He says that he knows the guy who hired the killer. Apparently, through his connections, he has met and spoken with this guy Kaneda, who apparently hired this killer, and they've spoken at length.
Theory number 2. The Korean hitman, a contract killer from Korea, hired to murder the Miyazawa family in order to speed up the demolition of their home for land development. Kaneda says, I know who the killer is because I hired him.
Right. And identifies him, gives Ichihashi the whole backstory.
Not only that, the book names the hitman, Mr. Lee.
I think this is a name that that Ichihashi has given the killer. He even says that this killer Lee was in Japan as recently as 2015.
He does these murders in the year 2000. He leaves his fingerprints and his evidence everywhere. And then he comes back into Japan subsequently to do another hit. How does he get back into Japan if he...
Yes, did the murders and then escaped overseas. But then sort of established himself as an international hitman based out of Bangkok, I believe. And sort of comes and goes, carrying out hits around the world.
I mean, I guess it's technically plausible. The mysterious Mr. Lee committing the murders on the orders of Kaneda. I talked to my friend, Hallie Sutton, about this hitman idea. She's a crime writer too. So now, Hal, you and I have discussed this case that I'm making this podcast about before.
Yes.
How much do you know about this case?
Not much. Only what you've mentioned about a family in Japan being murdered, that there was somebody that they believe was in the house for a long time, and that's about all.
One of the few existing theories about who killed the Miyazawa family is put forward by a guy called Fumiya Ichihashi, I believe is his name, which is a nom de plume of a journalist who's written a book, and he postulates that the killer of the Miyazawa family was a Korean Air Force man who was paid in order to wipe out the family. Just first impressions on that.
Doesn't sound super plausible to me. I would have a lot of questions about who's he being paid for and why isn't there a trace of that somewhere? And if he's getting paid to do this job, he does a spectacularly bad job of it. So it doesn't seem to me like a theory that makes all that much sense out of a cinematic realm. You're the worst hitman in the history of hitmen.
One of the key things that they need to be able to do is to get into the place, kill a person, and leave, right?
Right. Leave no trace.
Leave no trace.
My image of somebody who's a professional hitman is somebody who doesn't leave a lot to chance, that they are fully prepared. They know what situation that they're going to be walking into. They know who's going to be there. They know how they're going to execute it, which of course doesn't mean that everything goes according to plan, but I imagine a hitman is a meticulous planner. I have a hard time not believing that you wouldn't shoot somebody and then leave. A gun is easily disposable. People might make an argument and say that would be too loud, but if you're stabbing people, that's going to be loud and there's going to be a fight. It just seems way more efficient to me, which I would imagine is a concern of a hitman, to get in, do what you need to do, and get out. If I put that in a novel, I would get notes back from my copy editor saying, "Really? ? Right. Which is not to say that life cannot be stranger than fiction, but it seems like a very... it doesn't seem like anything that you've told me about the case squares with strong evidence that points in that direction.
Hal echoes my instincts. This doesn't sound like the work of a hitman. He'd have to be the worst hitman in the world. Except he got away with his crimes. Man, I just don't know anymore. Hitman, I'm not buying it. And neither, it seems, are the police.
毎日新聞報道の方と
As a book by a former newspaper journalist, I thought there must be something behind it. It must have some basis. It must be based on facts. So I read it, of course. But then when I read it, I discovered that there is nothing of any value to the investigation in that book.
ほとんど
My investigation into the Faceless Man was gathering pace. I'd followed the police's preferred theory, that the killer was a foreigner who'd come from Korea, and I'd found some holes. I'd examined the evidence from the sneakers, and I found holes there too. I chased down a popular theory, immortalised in a book, that the killer was a Korean hitman, but again, it just didn't sit right with me. So my search needs to go further. Next time, I break down the hours the Faceless Man spent inside that house. I look at the clues he left and unpack a brand new theory. Could it be there's not just one Faceless Man, but three? This podcast was written and hosted by me, Nick Obregon. My producers for What's the Story Sounds are Darrell Brown and Sophie Ellis. In Japan, my producer is Ryushi Lindsay. Sound design by Tom Brewins. Our music is composed by James Warburton and KPM Music. Our USG audio team includes Josh Bloch and Jennifer Sears. This is a USG audio podcast in collaboration with What's the Story Sounds. If you have any information or leads on this case, please email faceless@whatsthestorysounds.com or reach out to us on Twitter. And if you've enjoyed this series, please leave us a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. And check out more USG audio podcasts at usgaudio.com.